Good morning and welcome. This is the Informatica webinar entitled Creating Context with Data Discovery and Data Catalogs. This is the next installment in the Reimagine Data Governance series of webinars we've been running really starting back in 2018 and we'll be rolling more through 2019 as well. Firstly, let's do a quick set of introductions. My name is Andy Joss. I'm Head of Solutions and Data Governance for Informatica here at EMEA. And Steve?
Hi everybody, my name's Steve Hollier. I'm a data domain expert within the Solutions and Data Governance team.
Very good, thanks very much.
So Andy, why do we need data discovery?
I guess it's kind of handy we're having this webinar today to tackle that exact subject, Steve. And I think it comes back to a couple of key things. I think the first is really around some of the data trends that we're seeing in lots of our customers. I think that whole explosion in the amount of data, I think everybody knows probably a lot of these things, but in the new users, we saw a lot with GDPR, if you remember, lots of people maybe from a legal background, coming into the data community. We've got new types of data, obviously with all the unstructured world, of course lots of data in the cloud, and increasingly we're seeing lots of technology such as artificial intelligence and machine learning helping organizations and helping people be a lot more productive. So I think there's lots of changes in the way that data is being used, but actually I think we're at a tipping point, and really this is around, if you look at a lot of the leaders in organizations and how they're using the data, then actually there's some big things going on. So one is really around cloud, and actually this idea of multi-cloud. Well, lots of organizations are really buying into that idea, and as you can see from the materials, some organizations are looking at 4 or 5 clouds that they're having to work with. So there's data in lots of different places, more so than we've had before.
True.
Customer experience, actually that's probably an area where most organizations will be having a lot more focus, certainly in the coming years. Self-service BI, we've seen lots of that. Of course, data and analytics, yes, absolutely top priority. But actually for me, there's some really key point here on the slide, which is really this last point, which is actually lots of organizations admitted they just don't know where a lot of their data is. And if you're going to do things like customer experience, well, actually you need to know where your customer data is. And most organizations are saying, actually, we've kind of got a bit of a challenge in this space. So actually, I think being at that tipping point, I think that's starting to say, actually, we do need to think differently. We need to do some things a little bit differently. And that's really what we're talking about today. But in the context of what we do, we work in the world of governance and security, that actually that world of data governance has changed as well. Yes, it's been driven by some of those factors, but also the idea of data being a strategic asset. Well, we've talked about that for a long time, but actually I truly believe people are doing it now rather than just talking about it. Volume and complexity of data, well, just too much to try and handle in some cases. And of course, we've got lots of data-centric regulation, not just GDPR, but lots of other things coming along as well. For me, though, I think the world of data governance, the biggest single change that I'm seeing is organizations are seeing data governance being in place to help support what I call value-driving projects. And that's how it's going to contribute to the health and wealth of the business. It's not just about compliance as it used to be. So I think that some of these changes, I think, quite profoundly drive a change in the need in the change for behavior and how it's going to drive organizations to think about what they do differently. And that's really, I think, kind of the backdrop to why we're going to need some of these things going on. I think for me, in terms of the buying drivers, though, for a lot of the ideas around data governance, it's really coming from some different places, and that's really coming back to the last point we were talking about. And it's about the fact that actually if you look inside organizations, the type of projects or the programs they've got going on, so many of these projects and programs, they rely on data. So if you're going to rely on data, then actually you've got to rely on the organizational insights about that data. So in the world of data governance, whether it be for reg and compliance or next-gen analytics or empowering the workforce, actually just knowing data and knowing about your data suddenly becomes really, really, really important. Otherwise, how on earth are these things going to be successful? So I think that's a little bit of the background to that. I think there's also a change in some of the use cases as well, and I think this is kind of data governance really having grown up in the way that organizations are trying to support what we call data democratisation, the idea that data is for everybody, kind of by everybody. And yes, we still have those traditional use cases around reg and compliance and around the stewardship of data, just managing data as we've done in a very traditional way. Yes, they're still there, but actually, do you know where organizations are now, Steve?
Go on then, Andy. I'm sure you're going to tell me.
Absolutely. They're in the reporting and the analytics space. This is where all the action's happening right now. So if you want to do, great example, if you want to do some work on something for a new customer experience program using AI and machine learning, you can have the best AI tech you can have the cleverest people, the cleverest data scientists, but actually, do you know what? If you've got rubbish data, what are the outputs going to be?
Yeah.
They're going to be rubbish, right? So that the old adage we've always known of rubbish in, rubbish out, and of course that's the polite version, it's still true, but actually the tech in front of that's changed. So actually the use cases for data governance have kind of caught up to that, which is good, because they absolutely should have done. And actually I think for me the big steer where this is all going is this idea that actually data governance should be helping us drive being much more operationally efficient and should help drive our digital transformation. So now data governance has gone from being something that supported things from a little bit of a tactical viewpoint. It's now strategically part of where an organisation is going and how they're going to get there. Because digital transformation, as we know, tends to be data driven. So actually I think in terms of the background to all this, the why we need all of this, I think there's lots of things that have been changing, and I think we've kind of got to that tipping point, which is if we're going to do a lot of these things, we just need to know what all of the data is, and right now, that's going to be an issue. So I think probably for me though, having talked about all of that, I guess the big question for me though is what have all these things got in common, Steve? What is it that kind of binds them all together?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And the assumption is organisations actually do know where their data is, or where their key strategic assets is.
Okay.
You've already pointed this out from a strategic asset point of view.
Yeah.
You've got to the point they recognise they need to use that data in some particular manner. And they say they think they know where it is, and we've seen that in a number of companies. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily the truth.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and that's a challenge. So what else do all these things have in common? And what we look at is there's four main factors when we're looking at data.
Okay.
Is the data location accurate? Is the location up to date? Do they know what the data actually is?
Right.
Yeah, and how it's being used? And do they know what that data means? So all back to what you're talking about before, Andy, which is the context aspect of it.
Yeah.
And we're going to go through each one of those points in turn.
Okay.
But the one we're going to start with is, okay, well, let's understand, is the location of the data accurate? Is where we think we're pulling that information from, if we're trying to do a digital transformation project, if we're trying to put some analytics in play, are we taking the data from the right place or the right source that may be existing under the covers? So how do we know if that particular location is accurate for the data that we're looking for? One of the things they try to do is actually manual data discovery. Okay? We all know a company will start down that line, and that could well be a good starting point for some companies, but the problem is the time it takes. We've got to look at that particular part, the complexity that's associated with it, the risk that we've got the wrong data contained within there. What if we actually do run a report and we're using data from an incorrect location? It could actually cause us a problem later on down the line. Also, the volatility of data. Does data stand still, Andy?
Probably not.
Absolutely not. Every organisation wants to use data for different purposes, and therefore is constantly moving, flowing, or changing around the organisation. Keeping up with that is going to be practically impossible, and of course the scale that's associated with it. So let's look at that a little bit deeper. What you've got is, why isn't manual discovery an option?
Right.
Well, the first part you've got is the documentation analysis, understanding what information we've got, where it resides. We've actually got the specialists as well, right? Imagine, systems move so quickly. We've still got mainframes online that people are still using. There's some SME experts, etc. We need to make sure that the information that they've got is contained within some kind of documentation process. We don't want to keep constantly going to them. We need to be able to automate that, and constantly doing it through a manual process is not going to allow us. It's also extremely difficult to scale with the amount and complexity that we've got across organisations these days. So what we start to look at is kind of an automated scanning approach, because we get reusable assets. Once we start documenting it or crowdsourcing it or getting it from different areas, we can use it a number of times. Once the SMEs as well, they can incorporate this into these particular areas, and therefore those assets can then be reused when they've got in there. So we don't need to constantly go back to them. They can concentrate on their day job rather than being bugged by people like us that want to find information throughout the estate as well. And of course it's highly scalable.
So hang on a second, but let's just kind of give some context to this. So even small organisations have got lots of systems. A medium-sized organisation could have hundreds or thousands. A large sort of multinational enterprise could have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of systems. I mean, are we really talking about being able to cope with the automation at that kind of level? I mean, is that practical and feasible?
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing we will always start to look at, right, is that you want to start small, right?
Right.
When you look at your enterprise, companies will go, my God, when I've got a particular regulation to work towards, they might have, as you rightly say, even small-scale companies are going to have thousands of places that they might have information contained within. So they've got to be able to have an automated approach to that. So start small.
Okay.
Start where you need to understand where your particular assets are, and then build out from that particular point. Look at areas that you know and understand and build from that. So we use the scale, start small, think big, and scale fast. You're able to do from that approach. And this is an example of a particular European customer. They started to go down the actual discovery method, and they started to actually use the manual process. And guess what, Andy?
What?
They use spreadsheets.
Oh,
so we all love spreadsheets to be able to
love
document everything. But they had to actually stop that process. Why? Because the data wasn't trustworthy. Why wasn't it trustworthy? Because they were talking to different individuals. And those different individuals have a different perspective on what that data is or what that means to the organization. Of course they would do. And they also found that it wasn't trustworthy. So when they went back into a system or started to look at it from an automated approach, they suddenly found that some of the information contained within there had been missed out, right? Because one individual would see it differently as what was important to the business to what other areas would do. So they introduced a cataloging approach to this. In fact, they used some of our technology and the AI technology that we'll talk about a bit later on to be able to do that. And suddenly they found in this particular case, they were able to scan 5 data sources, which were quite big data sources, in 2.5 days.
Wow.
And let's remember, once they've done that once, then it's just iterative as they go through. They just can do it continuously.
Okay.
And we'll talk a bit about that later on as well.
Okay, good.
Okay. So what's the alternative then?
Yeah, you've kind of hinted at that, this idea of a catalogue and stuff.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Rather than actually putting it all into, what you can think about is actually an automated data discovery approach as we go through. And what that will help to do is to make sure the location of the data is up to date.
Okay, so that's a big problem with Excel, right? Because if I go and update a spreadsheet today and somebody goes and looks at it in a week or a month's time, they don't necessarily know whether things have changed or not. So I guess this idea about keeping things up to date must be an absolute nightmare.
Oh, yeah. And I worked with one particular client where we were talking to them about what they were going to do, and they had 700 data sources that they were trying to actually ascertain catalog their data within 7-month period. 700 data stores. Within 4 months, they'd only done 150 on Excel spreadsheets.
Okay.
4 months. So they've still got...
That's quite good, I think.
Yeah, for Excel. Yeah, absolutely. But of course, even when they've gone through that process, data doesn't stand still. We've already talked about the volatility, the scale, etc. It doesn't stand still. They've taken 7 months to go through it, and then they've got to go through it again. And is the auditor going to be happy with the fact that their data is 7 months out of date and they're making strategic decisions potentially on that information that's contained within there too?
And if you think back to what we were talking about earlier about organisations, kind of, the battleground for them will be around customer experience. Having up-to-date data, sure, it's got to be critical for the success of this kind of program.
Oh my goodness, yeah, you're absolutely right. So firstly, we actually need to know, would we hold all the information we need? Do we have all the information that we need? And where is it contained within these systems? Well, Andy, as you rightly said, is it in Excel spreadsheets? Well, actually, it might be, right? That might have been a starting point. There might be some of the information contained within there, but probably not all of it is contained within there. So, does the catalogue make sense?
Kind of does, I think.
One place that you could go and understand where all that information is.
Sounds good.
And start documenting it. So what we start to look at is, okay, unleashing the power of what we can do with a catalogue. Right? One place where you can go and understand where your data is to use for all those initiatives that you talked about very early on.
Yeah.
Things like customer centricity, things like analytical programs or things like that, or digital transformation things. And you've got to look at 3 main areas here. Of course, catalog and classify the information that you have. What data is restricted, what is confidential from that point of view. Find and discover where that information is. And then, of course, manage it. Manage it as a program going forward, and then maximize the opportunity. So you now know that the information that you're taking for the particular project that you're working on is from the right source, is actually the here and now, and it's kept up to date.
That sounds great, but we've kind of introduced this idea of a data catalog. Kind of what is it? Is it some kind of glorified database in really crude terms? What is it?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's like a map. It's the keys to your closet, let's say.
Okay.
Because we've talked about it. People use the term data is the new oil. Data is the new gold. Yeah, all of those terms are actually, so by all intents and purposes, catalog is actually the key to that gold. Imagine somebody was trying to look for oil across a particular country. If they had a locker that told them exactly where that oil was, wow, the money they could make from that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, this is what catalog is enabling them to do.
Like it. Like it.
So, the benefits from an actual particular data catalog, well, of course, we've got the self-service data discovery for analytics as well. So we can find and locate those data assets across the estate and make use of them and add the business context to them as well. Why do we need that information? Why is it contained there? Why is it being used in those particular sources?
Yeah.
From a data governance point of view, we're able to make the data available for the business if they're actually trying to work through a particular compliance program as well. It's there. They know where to look for that information.
Right.
Let's face it, whatever compliance project people are working on, whether it be GDPR, whether it be CCPA out of the US or something along those lines, or even LGBT in Brazil, they're all around now. They're actually asking for information about data, right? So we can use the catalogue to be able to support those particular programs. We've also been able to look at the impact analysis as well. So if we understand where the data is and how it's flowing, or we've got the lineage or the proliferation associated with it, we can look and say, okay, well, we've got a data asset here. We know that that feeds down to a program that's working here. What if we change this? What happens? What's the impact of that as it flows through the organisation? So we're able to see and visualise that part of it as well.
So I think what you're telling me here is in terms of the benefits of this type of approach. Remember we talked earlier about kind of the different use cases and where organisations are looking. So we've also got self-service discovery for analytics. That's kind of business focused. We've got IT impact analysis, which is kind of IT focused, and we've got data governance, which kind of sits, I guess, a little bit in the middle. But it feels to me like this would have benefits for kind of everybody in an organisation.
Yeah, the whole organisation. Yeah, cool. Absolutely.
That's even better.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just one area, but you've got to think, why is it important that we keep it up to date, though, Andy? Why?
Well, I think one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier was this idea of, as we're looking at our data, the data landscape changes, right? It changes all the time. So the thing that we're going to have to think about is, as the landscape changes, how do we keep on top of that? So, just something as simple as, if we're updating a spreadsheet and something changes in the landscape, what do we do? Well, actually, today we have to remember to go back and update the spreadsheet. But actually, it feels to me like that's sort of 1980s kind of thinking. It feels to me like we probably need to be doing something a bit differently. And this, to me, is probably one of the things that I see most amongst my customers, is this idea that change is the only constant. And if you look at the data landscape, I mean, you'll know from your security and your data management background about the introduction of new apps and the retirement of apps. Of course, changes to apps and updates. We've got new data sources, changes to sources, retiring sources. We've got data movement. And even in relatively small organisations, this is going on all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the issue you were talking about earlier, which was really kind of resonating with me, is that particularly in this world where organisations are going multi-cloud in particular, lots of people who are sitting in the business side, are buying into business services in the cloud because it kind of solves their business need. And suddenly we've got, well, where did that come from?
Yeah.
A whole new bunch of services. So this idea of that change is the only constant in the data world, I absolutely feel that's probably one of the key challenges. So keeping up to date, keeping on top of that, if we're going to drive things like our customer experience program or operational efficiency or even digital transformation, then we're going to have to think quite seriously about how we manage all of that update.
I think you're right, and one of the bits as well, of course, is security programs too.
Yeah.
Actually understanding those key assets and putting some protection in play for them. If we don't understand where those key assets are, how are we ever going to protect them in the right manner? We might have protected it in this particular source, but what if it's escaped into this particular area too? So from a security head, which I've got contained within there, I think this is really important.
Yeah. So I guess kind of flipping the background the other way then, Steve, is we talked about the need to keep the catalogue updated, but actually how do we do that?
Again, it's a very good point, Andy. So we've now got to actually try and look at, we've got the picture, right?
Yeah.
So let's imagine we've now gone down that particular program, and some might actually have done it from a point of view, of a manual process or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But we've got to make sure that we're continually monitoring. Too many people, let's talk about things like GDPR. Everyone looked at May 25th, 2018 as being the starting point, or the end point. We've reached our goal. Let's sit down. Yay, we've done it. We've got our information.
Ta-da!
But that's not true. Actually, that's the point when you can start getting fined. So now you've got to make sure that you're keeping that data up to date as you continue to go forward. So what we need is that continuous assessment.
Right.
You need to continually scan the information to understand the proliferation of the data, how it's moving, how it's flowing.
Yep.
Whether there's lineage as well, how that information is changing. Because if you don't keep ahead of that, then actually the updates that you've got contained within there, you might find that you're using the wrong data later on down the line. You had a good map at one point and the keys to the closet, it's now changed. You're going to have to look at the data volume. You want to see how much data you've got contained with it. Have you got too much? That is also a risk in some of the regulations as well, and a challenge that some of the systems have got. We need to look at the impact analysis as well of the data, because that can be costly, right? If you change something in this particular system and it has an impact in a further system down the line, if you don't understand the impact that's associated with that, that can potentially impact your systems quite badly and have a cost to the business. You want to look at the geographical location, things like cross-border controls, etc. as well. You want to know that if data is flowing through the organisation, if it flows outside of a particular regulatory body, for example, out of the EU, you want to know about that and potentially be alerted about that as well. We want to understand protection of data as well, going back to my security head as well. We want to understand that that data is protected in some way or managed, and if we identify it's in a source and it wasn't managed in some way or protected because that source hasn't got some controls contained within it, then damn well put some controls contained within it. We also want to look at things like user activity and then actually into user access as well. And that
what's going on with the slides?
Well, what we've got to make sure is that continually flows, Once you've done it once, that's not your sit down, that's actually your continual process as you go through.
Gotcha.
And so you start to schedule things. So once that system's been scanned, your key systems, you will then actually start to scan on a regular basis.
So this was the point earlier, when you talked about manual discovery not being something that's really going to make sense. It's not just the fact that you have to do this the first time, it's the fact that you have to do it the first time and then you have to keep it up to date, so you're doing it all the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. So the scanning decisions, right, Andy?
I think that point brings out something that's really interesting, which is how often you have to do this, which I guess we'll talk about a wee bit, but also the type of decisions that we're going to have to think about when we're scanning our enterprise, because that's effectively, I guess, what we're talking about. So for me, I think there's probably two big kind of areas to think about. The first one is what I call depth and breadth. And we've got to think about, we potentially got lots of systems, but actually we've got lots of data, we've got lots of metadata that goes with that. So there's lots of things that we have to think about. Well, do we want to scan all of it or subsets of it? Do we want to scan every record or just subset, all that kind of good thing? So I think we need to think about what I call the depth and the breadth. And I also need to think about frequency. So how often do we do this? So certainly there's going to be a one time. That's obviously going to be the first time. So that gives you the initial map, which you were talking about earlier. But then we've got there, well, how do we then pick up on all the changes? So do I want to do a full scan of my entire enterprise every day? Well, clearly not. I mean, from an operational viewpoint, that'd be mad. So the idea of just picking up changes, that kind of seems to make sense. That helps us keep it up to date. And often, how often is this needed? Excuse me. So do we need to do it every day, every week, every month? Who knows? So I guess there's lots of scanning decisions. Excuse me. And for me, this is about making scanning a business as usual activity.
Okay, right, absolutely right. So now what we need to do is they need to know what the data is. They need to apply some kind of context to that actual data. So how do you know what that data is? And if we start to look at it importantly, if you're going to use that data, you're going to have context to understand what that data is that we're using too. Do you agree, Andy?
I do.
So let's look at this. Give me an example of this particular process.
So actually that's a really good point, Steve, because this was the conversation that I had with an executive actually not that long ago. So let me give you a little bit of context for a second. Imagine you're an executive and you get given a report that's got some data in it. And just as a very, very simple example that you can see there on the chart of the type of data. Thing being, actually, as people, as individuals, human beings, we have this tendency to kind of make assumptions about things.
Well, that looks like my account numbers.
Really good point. So the question being, is this account numbers? Well, actually, we're making assumptions. So one of the key things that I always talk to organisations, particularly executives, is actually, what do these numbers mean? And where do they come from? So that's a little bit about what I call data context. So this idea of data discovery should help us answer those questions.
Great, yeah.
The reason it becomes important is I'm going to be making some assumptions if I don't have answers to those questions. So what kind of assumptions might I be making? Okay, so this is obviously about generating trust and how we do that, but just think about, you talked about account numbers. Actually, it's a date.
It's a date?
It's a date. And you kind of look at the format and you think, okay, yeah, it could be a date. But a date of what? You know, is it a start date or an end date of something? I don't know. Is it the order date or the shipment date? Is it a UK format? Is it a US format? Because of course they switch month and day around.
True, yeah.
So the point being, it's just the way that individuals, you know, we tend to fill in the gaps when we don't have the information, and that's you don't necessarily know we're filling in the gaps properly. So actually what the discovery is going to give us is the ability to give us the answers to these questions, because if we can do that, then we're going to start making the right decisions with it, because we've now got the right information. So it's not an account number, actually it's a date.
So I would have used it for the wrong purpose.
Correct.
I understand now.
Correct.
I understand. Okay.
But then this happens all the time. So the idea being is that if we can embed this into organisations, people will get more and more insight into the data that they use on a day-to-day basis. They should be making better decisions with it. Because ultimately, we're giving them the context that says, well, this is what it means, this is what it is, this is where it comes from, it's up to date. Therefore, we can make the right kind of decisions that go with that. And actually then, Steve, I think then probably the last thing we just need to talk about is actually what data means. Because that's kind of interesting from the last point about, well, we think it's a date or we think it's an account number. We probably do need to talk about what that data actually means. And that becomes important certainly from a governance viewpoint, because clearly a lot of what we do in the world of governance is around making sure that we know what data means.
Absolutely.
Right, it's a really, really important point. So if we just want to think about that for a second, just think about some of the common challenges that we see in this particular space. And I'm just going to give you a couple of very simple examples. I see this a lot. This is the insurance example, is the first one. It's where we have the same word, the same term that's being used in a business, but it means something different in different parts of the business. So in my example, it's around a term called premium. Right? In the insurance world, most people know what premium is. It's the money you pay for a particular insurance-backed service. So one business unit says, actually, we use the term premium, we mean premium before insurance tax. Another one then talks about after insurance tax. Another talks about after insurance tax, but before general sales tax, etc. So that's one example. Excuse me. Another example is where we're using a different word with the same meaning. This is a banking example. Somebody says customer, but they also mean client, they also mean party. Same word, so just different words, same meaning. So this is where a glossary should help. Okay, so what I've done here, excuse me, I'm struggling this morning, is to give you an idea of a simple term and how it would be viewed from a glossary viewpoint. And to give you some of the ideas of the things that we want to try and hold, to know about, one of which is what is it called, what does it mean. We also want to know how is it described, we want to know where it fits into the business. We understand where it fits into the business. Does it have things like aliases? Does it have a particular format? Does it also have a particular status? Do we know if it's being used and how it's being used? We want to know things like, what's its classification? We also potentially, almost certainly, would want to know, well, when was this last updated?
Yeah.
So linking what we've done in terms of the data that we've been able to go out and discover, and then linking that to something that enables us to understand the context of that and what it means and how it fits into the rest of the organisation, now starts to help me make better use of that data, because I know whether it's the data I'm expecting, and it's in the right format, it's telling me the things that I expect it to tell me, and I know it's up to date and it's relevant.
That's a brilliant example, because I worked with a particular company that asked me to look for a code called D number.
D number?
D number, that's exactly what I looked at.
Okay.
And they looked at me as much to say, well, that's an industry standard, Steve. How do you not know what that particular aspect of it is? So I looked at the business going, okay, D number, right, okay. Looked at the technical team and said, okay, well, I can search for it if you can kind of describe it. And the technical team was saying, no idea what D number is, actually.
Okay.
After talking to both business and technical, and that's what we're doing here, right? We're using the information associated from business and technical associated with it to understand it a bit further. When we decided to do that, D number happened to be a combination of account number and sort code, and that is how they identify customers within their particular business. Fantastic! We now have an understanding, and all we needed to do was document that as a usable asset, and that's where we contained it into something like the business glossary associated here, which then meant that we were able to scan and find it across the business and understand what it actually meant.
And I guess, coming back to your example of D-number, for that organisation, D-number was a standard or just a default thing. Everybody knows about it, but actually outside of that world, maybe not.
Exactly right.
Point being is actually this needs to be relevant for that organisation. So when you talk about D-number, we know exactly what it means. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess kind of coming a little bit back to your point earlier, when we were talking about that example of D-number, I think it's a really good example of this. But also for me, this is about having understanding and context. And if you think back to the example we had about that date, then actually what we're saying is actually we can use information we can go and discover through this cataloging technology we talked about to actually go and work out that the date that we're talking about, the metadata says actually it's an end date. So that's kind of giving us a clue as to how we can start to use this information. But we can also probably go and discover some other things as well. We can actually see that actually information was keyed in. No, interesting. So when you start to key information in, the likelihood of something potentially being not right probably goes up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
human error.
Exactly. We're all human, so these things do happen. So again, that starts to tell me a little bit about, okay, so how I might want to treat this information. And then also we can work out this UK account. So we can probably assume that this is a UK format date. Just 3 pieces of information we can probably go and discover really helps me understand how I can use that piece of information. So simple things like that make a massive difference in terms of how I can use the information and also the decisions I can make off the back of it. So I think that's probably a really, really important point. And for me, it's actually quite simple. So actually, without being able to answer some of these questions, how do executives in many organisations know they're making the right decisions on that data? And I think the big challenge for many organisations is until we've gone down this route, until people have felt the pain from it, quite often they don't recognise that this is a problem. But I think for many organisations, great example, I was with an organisation recently, I was looking at an executive dashboard and it gave lots of great information. It was really, really nice to look at.
Pie charts, bar charts.
Absolutely, but all very dynamic, 3D and all that kind of great stuff. Visually it looked fantastic. But when you actually then ask them simple questions about the example we had earlier, about the date, something as simple as the number of HR, from an HR viewpoint, the number of employees. And if you just have a number, let's say 500, okay, well what does a full-time employee actually mean? Where did that data come from? What happened to it? How old is that data? Is it today's data or this week's or last week's or next? It doesn't matter. The point being, until I have all the information around that data, then I don't know necessarily how I'm supposed to be able to use it or whether I'm using it properly or not. So I think this is a really common problem. I just don't think organisations recognise it.
So you've got to look at what is the data discovery challenge, what is the problem that you've got associated with all of this. So if we start looking at it, okay, then how do we find the data that's in scope for the particular program that we're looking for?
What do you mean by in scope, Steve?
So if we're looking at a particular program, so let's say, for example, GDPR or PCI or something along those lines, or they just want to run a particular analytical program, where is the data that they need for that particular program? And of course, we've spoken before, they've got a number of sources that might be associated with it. And it might be in the metadata that it's described in slightly different ways in those sources as well.
So probably true, yeah.
Simple example, a business that would have an HR system, a sales system, a contract and a marketing system. Look at that. We've got name, address, date of birth, religion in the HR system. We might have date of birth in the sales system because we're seeing something like DOB. So what we've got to look at is, well, are they all the same thing?
Okay.
So we've got name, fantastic, first name. So does that mean that in the other systems it's first name and last name combined together? Do they have a middle name contained within there? And do we have first name only in that first part? Or some people actually put first name and last name? So we've got to think about whether these are the same thing, or have these suggested to us as part of the program. To do that manually is going to be quite difficult to be able to do. What about this? Date of birth we've got as well. We've got it described in 4 different ways here. We've got date of birth. That's obvious from a metadata point of view, right? DOB, probably that's going to be date of birth as well. Might not be. DOB in uppercase, maybe, But BD, how is anyone looking at metadata going to understand that BD happens to be date of birth?
As in, it might be birth dates.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
okay,
It could be any
okay.
parts of that. So we've got that challenge as well. And look at those particular ones. We all love Z tables. I'm sure there's a number of people on the call that will understand what I mean by a Z table contained within there. How does a Z table or a Z column actually help us in any particular way? It doesn't give us any information about what's contained within there as well. So the metadata doesn't help us. And then other bits turn up as well. In some systems, we may have information that we weren't aware of or weren't tracking in other areas as well. So we need to understand when it came into there or what it's being used for.
Oh, okay, okay. So I guess with all of that, actually deciding how to find this data, just from some of the things you said, it sounds to me like we've probably got to think of a couple of different approaches. So one of which suggests that actually the names of things might work. So you talked to, simple example, it's the name of a column in the database. Well, that might give us some clues. And the example we've got on the screen here is it says email.
Yeah,
I guess with my data governance hat on, I'll be asking email of what, but
yeah.
let's kind of park that for now. But can we assume that's an email address? Well, possibly. I guess we just need to validate that. But I guess the other thing we need to think about is, like your Z table example, you might have to think about data patterns, how I've described that. And the idea that we don't actually use the metadata to go and see what it is, we can actually go and look at the data.
That's right,
To try and determine what these things actually are. So actually in an email, the pattern for an email is a relatively simple one. I think everybody probably recognises it's a pretty straightforward thing. I can imagine there's some others which are probably quite complex. So actually just thinking about how you do this seems to me that actually that's quite a sensible approach to think about either doing one or other, or potentially doing both, or combinations of, I guess, based on the type of systems you've got, the amount of data you've got, and the complexity you've got. So I think finding that data, it just says to me the decisions on how to do that and what approach to take, organisations just need to have the flexibility to do the thing that's right for them. And I guess then thinking about doing that across lots of different types of systems, so I guess organisations are complex. They buy technology that solves business problems. So they'll have lots of different technologies from lots of different vendors that do lots of different things.
Yep.
And it'll be on-premise and in the cloud, and it'll be sort of traditional systems and unstructured systems and big data systems and whatever else we've got. But the point being is we've got to do this across all of that landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's another problem we also need to think about. And then we've got to potentially do this across a lot of systems. And I can well imagine that for lots of organisations there are going to be tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands or more systems you have to do all of that across. And I think for me, your point you were making earlier about doing this manually, just as we've gone through this story, it just really comes home to me the scale of the problem that organisations have got and how we're going to have to think about using technology like a data catalogue to go and discover all this information, because frankly it's just too hard to do otherwise. And I think for me then just thinking about something that we do need to consider, that's really going to be around this idea of the how. So Steve, how would we do this?
So this is where we start looking at things like automated discovery, right? To be able to do that scale, to do that understanding, to make sure that we're using the same context every single time, we need to be able to look at something that helps us to be able to achieve that from the scanning capability, but also make some suggestions, some similarities, some understanding that we may not do ourselves. And that's where something like the AI-assisted cataloguing comes into play.
Yep.
A number of people that have heard some of my conversations before will always hear me talk about a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Why do we talk about a top-down and a bottom-up approach? Because there's two areas. We've mentioned it. There's IT and there's business. When IT look at a particular system, they're going to look at the metadata that might be associated with it, they're going to look at the data contained within it. They're not going to add the business context that's associated with it as well. And that's really quite key. So you're going to have to physically scan at the lower level to build up that catalogue from a physical understanding of what that data is. That's your logical assets. Then what you want to do is overlay that with the business context that might be associated with it, which is really what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
The two things have got to come together, and that's how the technology really works so well. So we define what we're looking for and then discover it, or discover it and then define how it is. It doesn't really matter which way around you do it, but you've got to add that context into what the data is contained within there.
Makes sense.
And we have some great AI technology that enables us to be able to support that. One such thing, for example, is actually what we call our Enterprise Data Catalog, EDC. Some people will have heard about it, supporting that. It's easy for it to be able to find that data. We can point it. Once we've defined it, we can point it and shoot. So I described that D number, right? Business technical coming together retailer. We know what D number is from a metadata point of view. We probably now know what it is from an actual data construct point of view, which means we can now go out and scan it. So every time it finds that particular part of it, it will highlight that to the particular catalogue coming through. We also get a 360 view. We get lineage and impact analysis, which are some of the things that we've talked about.
Just before you go off lineage, Steve, so one of the things that I was talking about in terms of those sources of information, I noticed that actually some of the sources for our cataloguing technology aren't just kind of like database-y type technology. They're actually technologies for moving things around, not just from Informatica, but also from third-party products. So is that how we're tapping into the understanding from an organisational viewpoint of how lineage...
So we start to look at some of the programs that would move data around, because that's quite difficult sometimes. There's some programs that actually transform. We've also got ETL engines, right? And that's not only Informatica. I'd love everyone on this call to be using an Informatica Power Center, but they may be using other ETL technologies as well. It's important that we have the understanding of that too associated with it. We might have files or macros associated with it as well. So there's going to be a number of things that might do a lineage flow. So we need to incorporate that into this technology as well. And we're going to have some crowdsourcing in there. And then of course we're going to have some inference and recommendations as well as we go through that particular engine. Okay, some of the other things that we need to look at is really important.
How to find information.
How to find it. Brilliant. We've done all this scanning. We've got this particular keys to your locker of wherever all the information is. How are we now going to be able to do it? And of course what we've incorporated, or what we've enabled people to be able to do, is almost they are used to using something like Google or Yahoo, as it used to be called, whether it's actually still there. Or Bing is the other one.
There are other search engines available. We just have to be clear.
Absolutely. But in this particular case, we're using something like a Google-like search engine that enables us to be able to put contract, email, customer, something along those lines into that particular field, and then it will start to look across the data catalog, or it'll start to look across that locker to understand where that information is contained. So you imagine, if you're trying to ascertain where your customer for customer centricity is, you can type customer in there, or whatever you're using from a metadata point of view, or glossary point of view, because you've defined it, you've got the context associated with it, and it produces that information. It brings it back for you, and shows how that information is relevant to you as well, as it goes across the organisation. What's really quite nice as well, you've got that lineage. So we can often find that a customer, so D number, we already said, right, is a combination of sort code and account number, right? Well, how did sort code and account number come together all of a sudden? Because now we've got, what, a 6 and an 8-digit character suddenly come together, and that's one long particular character. That's going to be derived somewhere. That's actually going to be amalgamated together. So we can look backwards and run the particular scans to understand how that information from a sort code and an account number came together, and which system caused that to be able to happen as well. So that's some of the lineage. Impact analysis is really quite key as well. So making sure that actually if we change this sort code up here, for example, or we move it to here, will that have an impact to the actual D number that we're producing further down the line? It could well do, and then that will cause a business challenge later on as well. We may not see updates flow through.
And I guess another example around D number, it may well be that in my part of the business, D number, the way I interpret it is sort code and account number. In another part of the business downstream, they might be thinking it's the other way around.
Excellent point, because actually it's just a long number.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
they know whether
whether
it's at the start or the end. You're absolutely right. And of course there's a lot of AI contained within here, and this is what's really quite clever. We're not only just trying to do it from a scanning point of view, we also have a lot of AI contained within there. So we've got similarity, so we're trying to pick up suggestions as well. We can do data tagging. So for example, if we pick customer up, we can actually put data tagging associated with it, that this is a customer in this particular context as well. And of course we can do recommendations. Andy, you looked at this. We believe you should also be looking at this part of it as well across the organisation too. So I think that's really quite clever and really quite key to help organisations to be able to do this at scale. Imagine doing this manually. Can you imagine doing this manually?
After having gone through this, Steve, I can't imagine that at all.
No, absolutely. So,
I think for me, what we've gone through this morning is a lot of the kind of this is too big a problem actually to try and do it in the traditional ways we've often done things, which is to do it by hand. I think we've really hopefully established the fact that doing this at scale with the complexity we've got, keeping it all up to date, we've really got to think about how we use and employ technology, and it's got to be smart technology.
Absolutely.
I think your point you were just making is about using things like AI, machine learning. I think it's really important, because I guess there's going to be things in the data. You can imagine huge amounts of data. There'll be patterns of things in there that human beings will never be able to spot. but I bet you an AI system could, or a machine learning system
It
could.
could certainly suggest it anyway.
If nothing else, and if you can raise things up to, you were talking earlier about alerts, for example. Alerts are good because it kind of draws our attentions to things, and then we can make decisions on it. And just from an AI viewpoint, it can bring information to us, and we can make decisions on it.
Absolutely.
We can decide to do one thing or another. So I think for me, that's really helped establish in my own mind that point we were talking about earlier, the idea that we're at that tipping point. I think for me, the kind of maturity of organisations and their approach to data, I think that's moved on really quite quickly. I think we talked to somebody a little bit earlier about it, but actually this point about organisations, they don't know where all their data or their customer data resides. I think actually we've probably got an answer to that question. And if we're at a tipping point where we have the capability to answer that question, that to me says organisations should be in a really good place to be able to take advantage of that. And the last point that you were just talking to about getting information out, we can have all the greatest technology in the world and the best catalogue in the world, but if you can't get the information you want from it, then actually it adds no value.
Yeah.
So the fact that I've got some things I'm really comfortable with, I know how to use a search engine, so I can take all the knowledge I've got from doing things on the internet and I can apply it to my data, and I can do it quickly, and it's up to date. That just seems to me to be massively beneficial for organisations. It's a big differentiator, I think, certainly in terms of helping drive things like customer experience and digital transformation programs. So, data discovery, I think what you've done this morning, Steve, is kind of take us through that actually it adds value across all the different trends, across all the different use cases that we've talked about, what's going on in the world of data governance and data. It just seems to me that this is probably a foundational capability, probably for pretty much every organisation, whatever they're doing and however they're doing it. And I guess it's a little bit about don't get in a mess, don't be in a mess, and I kind of like a little picture with people drowning in data with the words help. I certainly, from my own experience, I've kind of felt in that space. I think really where we want to try and get to is actually we want to be able to pick out and find the things that we want and know it's the right thing. So coming back to your map analogy or the keys, actually I want to know I've got the keys for the right thing, and then when I open that locker I want to know I'm looking for the thing that I want and that's right and relevant for me, and I don't want to know about everything else.
Yeah, you don't want to open the locker and find that the information's gone because it actually wasn't in there anymore.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this idea, I think, of cataloguing the data and creating that catalogue, I think, this morning, I think for me, it's really opened my eyes as to how important, how foundational that is, I think, for lots of organisations going forward. I'm just conscious that we're kind of running a little bit short on time, Steve, and I just wanted to try and get through a few questions that we've had coming in. So I'm just going to kind of stop you there. I've just got a few questions for you, if you don't mind. So just let me read a few out to you. So first one we've got here says, scanning a large system will take time and we'll need to keep doing this to keep it up to date. So great, we talked about that. How can you help reduce the infrastructure overhead of scanning? And I get the sense that's possibly about, maybe we talked about some of those scanning decisions. How do we think about scanning decisions and how you implement those?
Yeah, so some of the things you can do is understand which are your key systems, which are the environments that are important to you. So start small, well, we always talk about it, start small.
Yep.
Yeah, and then think big.
Yep.
And then scale fast.
Okay.
Right? So build out from those smaller systems, actually pick those, define what they've got in there, and what you'll probably find is 80% of what you need is then contained within those systems because they're the ones that you're using all the time.
Yep.
Once you've done that part of it, then you can start scanning the surrounding systems and you'll start to build out that catalogue and you'll get 98 to 100% contained within there. So that's that start small business.
I guess just kind of adding to that, and this is a thought that was something that came up as you were talking earlier, Steve, it's this idea of when we're making those scanning decisions, I guess we also want to have a bit of flexibility to say, actually, in terms of the value that we bring back to our program, do I need to scan everything in a system in day one to get value, or can I make some decisions that I don't want to have to scan everything?
No, so we have some companies that will start with just a metadata scan, for example. So they can scan just those particular metadata. They might get most of the information contained within there. Then when bits are missing, then they can do a data scan associated with it. You also don't have to scan every single record.
Okay.
Because once you've picked the context off of you could have 1 million rows in a particular area, right? If you take the first 10,000, it's more than likely within that first 10,000 you're going to identify what that particular column is contained within there. So you can do that part of it as well. There's lots of scaling and profiling options that will help you to reduce the overhead that's associated with it as well, and certainly doing it in a batch window is probably a good idea as well from that point of view.
Yeah,
although it's only a read.
Yeah, indeed, and I think for me, that idea of the fact that you really can start small, I think that says a lot in terms of kind of this idea of making this successful. Because clearly, if we, trying to scan an entire enterprise is not going to happen overnight, and clearly we have to build up to be able to do that. So being able to start small and showing value, I think, is really important. So great, thank you. I've got another question for you here. It says, what type of technical infrastructure is needed to support your data catalog?
Well, the good thing is that this is actually built on a big data platform anyway.
Okay.
And most businesses seem to be moving towards a big data platform. So you've already got a lot of this infrastructure in play that we can then reuse to be able to support it as part of the program.
That's perfect. And things like, I could see from some of the screenshots, it's all browser-based. It looks like Google and other kind of search engines. It feels to me like this is very naturally aligned with the way people work in business these days anyway.
Yeah, there's been a lot of good feedback about the UI and how it works in that particular, allowing people to be able to really find the information. And then, come on, Andy, you're asking me questions. I've got questions that come in for you as well.
Okay.
So you kind of been using your use cases. Can you explain more about how data governance supports operational efficiency programs?
Okay, yeah, no, this is a really good question. Actually, I've seen quite a few organisations looking at how the discovery of information and how it links to the data governance. Just let me give an example. So one of the organisations that I was talking to, they see this as being a core part of how they're going to make their business more operationally efficient. And the way that they see that is to say, actually, there are lots of people in their organisation who what I would call are knowledge workers. These are people who are dependent and totally reliant on data to be able to do their job, but they're not data professionals. And I think that's a really key point. So lots of organisations will have people who kind of fit into that category.
Yeah.
So if I can give them a data catalogue and the associated tools, I get most of their day, they probably spend their time just trying to find the data they need to do their job.
Yep.
But because they're not data professionals, they just need some simple tools and some things to help them find the data that they want to do quickly.
Yeah.
So a data catalogue, if we've done the hard work for them in the data catalogue, and we've given them a really simple interface to work with, or of course, because everything's microservices and API based, we could probably link it into other things that they do with their day jobs anyway, or the apps that they use. We've probably got now a way of very quickly enabling those people in those knowledge working communities to find the data they need a lot quicker, a lot faster, and it's probably a lot better data anyway. So certainly operational efficiency, just from a human viewpoint, we can drive massive change by having this in place, and building that out over time obviously means we can stagger the value over time. But I guess a bigger concept kind of going a little bit further down the track then is actually operational efficiency. For most organisations, it's kind of like a scorecard activity that kind of sits at the board level. So the more that we can get from our human capital in terms of efficiency and what they do, for most organisations that's probably a vital key contributor to the health of the business. So I think that there is very much a direct link between what we're doing from a cataloguing and a governance viewpoint, how it drives operational efficiency, and more importantly, how it contributes to the health of the business.
Wow, okay. Yeah, so I can really see how that catalogue could fit into the wider data governance program as well. Could you give some examples of that?
Yeah, I think so. So, really good examples. Lots of organisations are thinking about how technology will be used. So if you're working on a compliance program, for example, things like lineage is probably a really important point. So actually being able to try and generate lineage automatically would seem to be a really, really important thing that we'd want to do. And clearly we talked about some of the technology that can do that. So I think there's lots of areas where we would want to try and address some of these issues. I think the other thing, and actually this is another question which has just come in, is actually how you link these assets to things like business processes. And one of the things that we talked about on previous webinars is the kind of different parts of the data governance landscape. Discovery is one part of that, but clearly that's really about understanding the rich metadata that we can go and find across the enterprise, but also linking that to things in the business world. It's not just processes, but also things like projects and regulations. That's absolutely important. So actually being able to link these assets together from a wider data governance viewpoint, I see that as being a major driver for how organisations are going to understand a much broader view of change. So for example, if I'm going to introduce a new customer onboarding program or a new set of services around customer experience, I want to understand what the impact is going to be. I want to understand what it's going to influence and what it's going to change. And actually being able to link what we have in the catalogue to what's going on in the business world, we ought to do that. But actually I think it's a fundamental thing that we have to do for organisations to make success of their programmes. So hopefully that answers that question.
It does, yeah.
There's another question here for you, Steve, which is about, can this be run in the cloud and can it be automatically provisioned?
Yeah, so absolutely this can be installed in the cloud quite happily. We've got a mixture of companies that will install this in the cloud. It can run quite happily on Azure or into AWS, and we've got AMIs that will be able to provision that as well. It will be about the connectivity to some of the systems. Some systems are actually, some companies are prohibited against the cloud because, of course, remember what we're talking about is keys to locker.
Yeah.
So to actually install some of the keys to locker into the cloud, they're not so au fait about that part of it. Others are absolutely cloud-first based companies, and they can install it in the cloud, and we support that quite happily too.
Cool, sounds good. We are very, very nearly at the top of the hour, so I guess we've probably got one last question for you, Steve. Question is, we're in the middle of automating much of our GDPR data processing. That's probably going to be quite a common topic, I think, amongst many on the audience. Can your discovery solution spot when data is going somewhere it shouldn't, or if data is being used for inappropriate purposes?
Yeah, so part of the technology as well enables us to be able to build on what we already know. So once we've done that scanning capabilities as well, we have other areas contained within there that allow us to then be able to pick up who has access to data and who is using data as well. So if we think the data is being used for inappropriate actions, then actually we can highlight that. We call them security policies. So we put in place security policies, and the technology has a lot of policies in there that allow us to identify if something out of the ordinary might happen. And one of those is obviously another point you made, which is the cross-border that we spoke about before. So if data moves across a border or outside of a system that we wouldn't have expected to, we want to know about it. So that ethnicity that you talked about in one of the examples, actually I talked about as part of the process, if we saw it suddenly flow into another system, well, we want to alert on that, don't we?
Yeah.
We want to save that information because it's probably something that under one of the governance programs we need to know about. So we alert upon it, and then we can decide whether it's being used for the appropriate reason, and if it's not, then why the heck did it flow into that particular system in the first place? So absolutely, we can do that as part of the process.
Great, Steve, great answer. Listen, Steve, thanks very much for your time this morning. Unfortunately, we are just about to run out of time. So I'd just like to say, Steve, thank you very much. A great contribution as ever to the whole conversation about what's going on in the world of reimagining data governance. I guess the one final word from me is that in all of the series that we talked about, we've been trying to explain some of the issues that we're seeing organisations trying to tackle, and we're also trying to suggest some ways that organisations can think about going about tackling some of these. Hopefully you're finding value from all of these. We will continue to run some more of these, but we're also running a number of events. So you'll find a link on the Bright Talk. There's a web page where we're running a number of events talking about some of these technologies and how these problems are being addressed. The next big event we've got coming up is on the 2nd of April in London. It's a specific event, but we will be running events across the EMEA territory and across other territories as well. So we'll be bringing this topic to you in your location, wherever you happen to be. My name's Andy Joss. Joining me this morning was Steve Hollier. We're from Informatica, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andy.